Hi everyone, welcome to Mr. H on YouTube. Today we are going to be talking about decolonization of Africa and how Africa went from a mostly colonized continent into almost a completely independent continent, and all the trials and tribulations that the people of Africa went through during this time period. This is an overview, so if I seem like I'm being vague, feel free to comment down in comments for questions and answers video on maybe some specifics that you would like to know after watching this video. But before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe to Mr. H on YouTube. We are at 61 subscribers so far, which is awesome. And we'd love to get up to 70 subscribers next couple of days. So stick around to the end of the episode today to hear about what's going to be coming up in the channel. But let's get into decolonization. So the colonies were pretty set after World War One. Germany had lost most of its colonies after their loss in World War One had been given to Britain and France. After that, the colonies were set all the way up till World War II. World War II is a very important time period for Africa because it begins the decolonization process. Now, the reason that decolonization began in World War II and throughout the post war era was that the war had been fought as anti German and Japanese imperialism, which was kind of ironic because two of the most powerful imperial countries in the world, Britain and France, had been fighting on the other side of it. It seems like the height of hypocrisy for Britain and France to fight against German and Japanese imperialism, to go around and say, nope, but we're going to keep going on with our colonies in Africa and around the world. The United States had become a global power, and they were in competition with the Soviet Union. Both of these nations were anti-colony, and the United States in particular was very forceful in uh, um, telling the British and the French that they should lose their colonies. So the colonization process began around World War II and would go on into the 1980s and 90s. As we move on, the decolonization efforts were very, very sporadic and not very well planned or timed. There was hardly ever any transition power. There was not really much infrastructure put into place in Africa. This is in contrast to places like India, where years and years of planning went into the decolonization of India and the partition into Pakistan and India proper. In Africa, the decolonization was for the most part rush. It was a rush job. Uh, some nations are good examples, like Kenya or Gambia or Zimbabwe, where basically the within the span of a year, less than, the colonial officials would leave. They would take a lot of the resources and stockpiles of money that was in the country, and then would go. And it was basically up to the Africans living there to try to make their own way. And so, really, when it came to the colonies, they were ill prepared and also ill equipped for their own independence. This wasn't really the fault of the African people, this really was the fault of the colonizers themselves. But when it came to the independence movements themselves, there were several different models of independence. Um, some models were like in South Africa, where the minority white people living in South Africa continued on to rule, using oppression and heavy handed police tactics to keep the majority black population in a second class status. This is called apartheid. South Africa was not the only African nation that utilizes this method, where white minority rule was prevalent. Another uh, way was where we would see a unified democratic front. Unfortunately, this was pretty rare when it came to the colonies, where the different groups would come together and join together in democracy and in peace. The most common independence movement usually orientated around military upheaval. Where military commanders would utilize their influence over armies and fight for control of the nation. This is where we would see the stereotypical uh, strongman personality of these African warlords. Unfortunately, this leads to maybe one of the most uh, uh, infamous examples of decolonization and the effects of decolonization, which was the Rwandan genocide. The Rwandan genocide really gives us an idea and a snapshot of why the colonization of Africa was so devastating to the development of the nations of that continent. Rwanda was really not supposed to be a country, as were many former colonies in Africa. They were amalgamations of different tribal groups that were arbitrarily put together. So, for instance, there are several nations where the same tribal group is divided up amongst several different uh, nations in modern day Africa, simply done to the fact that that's where the colonizers drew the line. And then you'll have, for instance, in cases of like Rwanda, where you have two very antagonistic tribal groups, the Hutus and the Tutsis, who are together in the same nation. The Rwandan genocide was a tribal war between, and became an ethnic genocide between the Hutu and the Tutsi tribes, leading to hundreds of thousands of deaths, and unfortunately marked a significant world crisis, but also was a marker of the nations of the world's ineffectiveness and basically apathy towards the conflicts in Africa. But there were some positives of decolonization, some positive examples. Let's go back to South Africa, where by the 1980s and 1990s, the minority white rule began to come to an end. This was an example where international pressure and also the domestic problems finally culminated in the election of Nelson Mandela as the first ever black president of South Africa. Uh, as South Africa transitioned, Mandela becomes a world famous figure for his consolidation of both white and black South Africa into one new nation. Now, unfortunately, in the new century, South Africa has had its problems, including dealing with corruption and such. But the lessons that Mandela showed are truly great examples for the world, and particularly for the people of South Africa. There are several success stories in Africa. Burundi and Nigeria have developed themselves into great powers. But when it comes to the continent as a whole, the violence, the horrors of decolonization, and the wars and conflicts that followed really left a lasting impact on the development of these nations. It's something that we can take from that when we look at Africa, and the stereotype would be to look at them as, poor, pitiless. Groups of people who, oh, they're just bad luck. Well, maybe, but in my viewpoint, and I think I'm not alone in this, I see it as truly the fault of and the horrors of that 17th and 18th and 19th century desire to exploit the work and labor and resources of a continent of people. And as we go forward into the 21st century, we'll see what the future has in hold for a continent home to a sizable population of our planet. But what do you think? Comment below with your own thoughts and questions about the decolonization of Africa, and I hope you guys are sticking around and keeping the subscriber button up for Mr. H on YouTube, because on Friday we will have a special treat video for all of us, and it may just be a little bit of a musical related. But we'll see you then. I'm Mr. H on YouTube. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all later. Bye bye.